guys can hear me, give a thumbs up. Okay, I'm going to, I have a pillow over my phone, so I can't get feedback, hopefully, from Kirk, since it's coming through my phone. But I just wanted to say hello to everyone. My name is Connie Harrington. I used to work for the Pacific Northwest Research Station, and I retired last year, so I still have an emeritus appointment. And like most people, I can't work from my office. I'm actually working from my home. I've known Kirk for a few years, and we've talked about different topics, and he asked me if I would talk a little bit about what I call neglected species in the Pacific Northwest. So my plan is to just give a few kind of introductory slides, take a couple questions, just because I know this isn't a forestry group, it's an ecology class. And so just to see if early on I'm using words that you're not familiar with. Then kind of maybe a little over halfway through, I've got another question break, and then at the end. So hopefully you won't have to keep your questions, hold your questions for too long. Okay, so what is a neglected tree species? And I will admit that neglected is a term that I use. It's not necessarily a term that's very broadly used. But I use it to mean any tree species that has not been much studied or managed. And some people in the past have called these minor tree species, but I've, over the years, gotten very frustrated with the term minor because it implies that the species is unimportant. So I think of them as more species that have been neglected, not species that are unimportant. So in the Northwest, this is basically any species other than Douglas fir, western hemlock, or on the east side, ponderosa pine. So by my definition, excuse me, this would include all hardwood species. Let's see if I can move my grid up to the top so I'm not blocking all my own slides. Okay. So all hardwoods, of which there are quite a few, and many neglected conifers also. So the true firs, grand fir, silver fir, noble, white fir, subalpine fir, cedars, yellow and red, the pines, western white lodgepole, Pacific yew, the spruces. Sometimes people say, well, why do you consider red cedar to be a neglected tree species? Because it is harvested quite a bit, and you see it used for a lot of different products. But I consider it to be mostly a species that's older trees are being mined, but it's not actually being managed. And so there's not a lot of information about the species. So I still consider it to be a fairly neglected species. So whenever I'm starting to look at a new species, whether it's moving or going to a new area or thinking about studying a new species, I always start with reading about it in the Silvics manual. And I also like to look and see if there are conferences on the species of interest. So for example, a few years ago, there was a conference up on Vancouver Island on red and yellow cedar that has quite a bit of information on the cedars. So I think it's really important to understand the ecology of species because the characteristics differ. And if we're going to consider managing them, we really need to understand what their ecology is. So I provided Kirk with some different resources, and I included the 2 volumes of Silvics of North America, one on conifers and one on hardwoods, and he said he was going to post them. So I assume you've got access to these somewhere. And sometimes people don't understand what the term Silvics means, and it's it's basically looking at the ecology of individual species as opposed to talking about the ecology of a whole ecosystem. So in these Silvics the Silvics manuals, they have hundreds and hundreds of chapters, a chapter on each individual species. And they include a lot of information, starting with their range and you know, the types of soils they grow on, and pests, genetics, just a whole lot of different things that, you know, I find to be really useful background information. So I mentioned that the hardwoods are all kind of neglected species, and some of the major ones in this area include alder, white oak, maple, madrone, cottonwood, and ash. And just as an example, they vary a lot in their maximum height and maximum age and whether or not they're shade tolerant. So that will just, sometimes you think about, well, maybe I'd like to manage in a certain way, but when you realize, oh, that species isn't shade tolerant, then it was not going to survive in the understory with other species. So it's just always important to understand kind of the basics about the species. So I'm going to talk mostly about hardwoods today, and the question always comes up, why study and manage hardwoods? And there's lots of reasons, and the reasons are going to differ depending on what species you're talking about. But basically, hardwoods provide substantial wildlife benefit and visual interest in what in the Pacific Northwest is primarily a conifer-dominated landscape. And hardwoods are sources, hardwood areas are sources of great biodiversity and also, cultural legacies. So all hardwoods are resistant to laminated root rot and to Swiss needle cast. Excuse me, need a Kleenex. Some of these very common conifer diseases, and most of them can be marketed if that's one of your goals. So just where we are so far, talking about this Silvics, any quick questions before I dive into talking about the hardwoods?
For Silvics, how would you go about studying the single ecology? I figure that's really difficult with everything being so integrated.
Yeah, well, it's going to depend on the specific question. So for example, if you want to know how shade tolerant something is, you can either observe it or you can actually study it, say in a growth chamber or greenhouse type situation, and see what level of photosynthetically active radiation it needs to germinate, to grow, to survive. The same thing in terms of like pests. You can look at things naturally, but you can also do types of studies where you're putting something into a caged area and introducing different pests and seeing how that species, how susceptible that species is compared to others. So there's lots of different ways that you can do it, but you're certainly correct that some of the things are kind of tricky because species don't grow one at a time, but it's just a way to kind of pull out basic questions about individual species. Anything else right now? Okay, great, thanks. So I'm gonna cover up Kirk again. They're two very different, I call them sisters, two different sister species in the Northwest, hardwood species, that in addition to their silvical characteristics, they differ in a lot of other ways. So for example, red alder has increased over time since European settlement, the area of red alder, and they've determined that from pollen studies. It's a species that you need to manage its density very early for log value. So if you're trying to manage it primarily for um, financial return, you need to understand that. And the market for logs really rewards quality. So you may not have really thought about it, but when trees are harvested, they primarily go into two main markets, either saw logs, so cutting them for boards, or pulp, so things like making paper and boxes and things like that. And pulp is a very low value product. And so what you're trying to do if you're growing something for commercial value is you want to be able to produce logs. On the other hand, Oregon white oak, the area has decreased substantially since settlement, primarily because the Native Americans used to keep areas open with burning. And since that burning, widespread burning stopped, there's been conifer encroachment, and other species have come in and overtopped the white oak. So removing overtopping conifers and planting new areas are really top priorities if you're interested in oak. And people are usually interested in managing oak because of its wildlife and biodiversity objectives. Areas with oak have a lot of different species, both understory species, as well as insects, birds, other things that are associated with them that are not found generally in conifer forests. So red alder, as I mentioned before, it's shade tolerant, it's not particularly long-lived. It doesn't grow well on dry, hot, windy sites or areas that have frost pockets. It tends to have very fast juvenile growth, which slows rapidly with age. So you really, if you're going to manage it, you need to plan to manage it for early in the life. Regeneration, it's primarily from seeds. Young stems can sprout. Older trees rarely will stump sprout, but young ones will. Can fix nitrogen from the air with an actinomycete that lives on the roots. It's not really a problem with stem rots. Some people have suggested that growing alder after alder is not always best. The markets for alder used to be very poor, but they've been fairly good and stable for quite a while. One of the, I think, very fascinating things about alder in terms of its ecology is its bark. And people tend to describe alder bark as being light gray or even white, when in fact the basic bark color of alder is brown. And the color that you see is actually because it's covered with these different types of lichens. And if you're ever up around like Port Angeles, there's a pulp mill up there, and you can see some areas around town that have alder, and the trees all have brown bark instead of this kind of colored bark. Down near Centralia, near the old steam plant, the same thing. You'll see areas with air pollution, you don't see the lichens on them. So I just always find that a kind of fascinating thing, that what we think is the bark of the tree is actually what we're seeing are lichens. So there are different factors, soil site factors, that are important in determining whether something's a good site for alder. There is a site quality evaluation guide if anyone's interested in the details, but it includes things like elevation, precipitation, factors influencing soil moisture, what kind of negative factors there would be, nutrient availability, its tolerance of pH, flooding, things like that. So lots of different ways in which you can evaluate maybe whether something would be a good alder site or not. So one thing I think is important is that most tree species in North America, their optimum sites are going to be moist but well drained. So red alder can tolerate some wetter conditions. So if you look at the red curve, it can go into the wetter conditions further, but it's not the best conditions. The best conditions are still going to be the moist but well drained On the other hand, Douglas fir can tolerate drier conditions than alder can. So just another example of, in this case, the silvics of the species, the type of rooting they have and how they're, how tolerant the needles or leaves are for drought, and their root characteristics influence how well they're going to do on different kinds of site conditions. So I mentioned laminated root rot. It's a common conifer disease. All hardwoods are immune, and a lot of times when you read information about alder, they often talk about planting alder on areas that have laminated root rot. And the idea is that because hardwoods are immune and alder can be a valuable tree species to manage, that might be one to consider. But I always like to emphasize that the fact that there's a high infection level of this conifer root rot does not mean it's going to be a good alder site. So that's just always something to keep in the back of your mind. Be kind of suspicious that, just make sure that it's going to be a good alder site, not just a species that could grow because there's a conifer disease there. And then there was a suggestion back 30, 40 years ago that alder could be used to kind of sanitize the site. But in fact, that's not shown to be true. It was based on some information in the lab using petri dishes, and they found that alder had a negative effect on the disease-causing organism. But in reality, the root systems can contain this laminated root rot organism for many, many decades, and planting alder on a site is not going to quickly sanitize it. And if you do have alder plantings on a site that's not really a good alder site, then those, call them off-site plantings, will be under stress. So alder roots, I always think they're really interesting looking root systems. They tend to be very fibrous. That means they have a lot of second and third order roots, so not just a few main roots. And it has the root nodules that can fix atmospheric nitrogen. So people tend to think of alder as looking in a certain way, but in fact, the actual size, crown form, and branching of alder vary greatly based on its history. And these are both pictures I took in Southwest Washington. The monster tree is at Cape Disappointment State Park. And you can see you've got this huge tree that's got giant branches. On the other hand, the picture on the left is one in which it's been grown fairly dense, and it's self-pruned, meaning that the lower branches have died off, very straight, and very different level of epiphytes, or the lichens and mosses and even the ferns, very different from one tree from one of these pictures to the other. So one thing that we often emphasize from a management point of view is when you can do different types of treatments. And in management, we call them treatments. And I know sometimes people think it sounds like we're talking about a medical treatment or something, but these are just management treatments. It's a general term that we use. And if you can see the tree that's at age 20, this is the pattern, the line is the pattern of height growth. I don't know if you can see my cursor. See my cursor, but if you have a tree here at age 20, it can still continue to grow to age 30. And so if you thin it early, then it has the opportunity to grow in height, which means that the crown of the tree can grow as the tree is growing in height. Whereas if you're thinning later, if you're looking at the tree later in its life, it's not going to grow a lot more in height. It may survive for many years, but it's not growing much in height. So it's a lot harder for that tree to put on additional leaves and branches to support tree growth. So just some examples, and for those of you who are interested in alder, we're lucky we have the Hardwood Silviculture Co-op, which is down at Oregon State University, and they have quite a few different publications and annual meeting reports and things, and they've put in a whole series of plantations and different types of trials that have been reported on. And so Kirk said you maybe later in the semester or quarter will be doing some things related to alder, and so this would be another information source for you, would be checking into what's online for the Hardwood Silviculture Co-op. But basically with silviculture, if you're trying to grow logs, what you want to try and do is keep the growth rates up. And so here's an example of a tree that has been growing very well, fairly evenly throughout its life. In this case, this is a tree that was grown at a fairly wide early spacing, and it has some large lower branches. And so if you wanted to produce a tree that was going to be more valuable for logs, you would want to consider having a closer early spacing or pruning some of those branches later on. So just the thinning response, generally what they've shown with the Hardwood Co-op is that you get your best response from thinning if it's done early, before year 10. It doesn't mean that there can't be any benefit to thinning later, but you're going to get your biggest benefit if you can thin early. And just another example, and here you can see you've got an unmanaged stand, how it's changed in diameter over time, and then what's happened if you had a managed stand. So you can see that the big difference is happening in these early years. So if you can get in there and manage the density of the stand, that is the number of trees that are present, you can keep that low, you're going to have much better growth for a long period of time. So fungi, there's lots of organisms out there, but live alder is not deficient in its ability to fight decay. And I probably am going to say this 3 or 4 times, but there were some early reports talking about insects and diseases that indicated that alder was not decay resistant. But in fact, when they've done specific trials, they found that as long as the tree is alive, it actually does not have a lot of decay in it. And so early on, people were saying, oh, you couldn't do this or you couldn't do that because it was going to create all kinds of decay problems. So you couldn't prune or you couldn't thin because maybe you would damage the other trees. So, but there have been some pathologists that have gone in more recently and have done some excellent studies that have shown that the old ideas were not correct. Now, once the alder stems are cut down, then they do decay very rapidly. So you wouldn't want to use alder to make, outdoor furniture or use it in a project outdoors where you wanted the logs, the woody debris to last for a long time, because alder will decay quite rapidly. So this is kind of technical, but the losses due to stain or decay between when you actually cut a tree down and when it gets to the mill and is cut are much greater than the losses from decay in actually living trees. So what this means is if you're actually going to plan a project where alder is going to be felled for market, you need to plan ahead of time as to how quickly you can get those felled trees to the mill. So not just, leaving them on the side of the road, waiting to be picked up by a log truck several months later. That would be a very undesirable thing to do. So one thing that you'll see sometimes on alder is sapsucker damage. Sapsuckers are a type of woodpecker. And I've just found it really interesting, but they definitely have favorite trees. So, there may be, they'll come back to the same tree over and over again, both from day to day, but also from year to year. And so you wouldn't want to prune these trees. You wouldn't want to thin to release these trees, because these would never become a valuable log. On the other hand, I would always leave these trees out there for their wildlife benefit, and just realize that they're not going to become a valuable tree. A valuable tree from a wood product standpoint. Of course, it's valuable to the sapsuckers. And then alder is often found in riparian areas, and there's often different reasons that people talk about what they want to do in riparian areas. And so sometimes there's a need in some streams to recruit or add large coarse woody debris. And because alders don't become as large, and also because they decompose more rapidly when they die, you would definitely want to have conifers for that purpose. On the other hand, you wouldn't want to eliminate alder from riparian areas. It has high quality leaf litter for a lot of insects, and alder has high nitrogen in its leaves, and those leaves help feed riparian productivity. And the fact that it has lower crown density means that the streams are going to be warmer, which generally means they're going to be more productive. So I'm going to stop for a minute here and open it up for some questions on alder. I know I kind of threw a lot of different kinds of information at you. So,
Connie, can you hear me yet?
Yes, I think I can.
Oh, hey, fantastic. All right. We can turn off our phones then.
Okay, success.
I got a question about the sapsuckers. So alder will not compartmentalize that damage and kind of grow around it and recover. Can you pretty well assume that sapsucker damage is chronic and never count on that tree becoming a good saw log or veneer or anything in the future?
So what they've shown is when you have that kind of sapsucker damage, yes, the damage can be overgrown if the sapsuckers don't come back to that tree. But what happens is when the tree is cut and milled, you get what they call ring shake, and the boards come apart. And so nobody wants a tree that is going to have ring shake. So if there's any indication of that on the tree, the buyer would not want to take that as a saw log. So from a saw log standpoint, it's not going to be valuable. And in fact, as I said, many times the sapsuckers tend to come back to the same trees over and over again. I don't know that it's completely known why, but I think the feeling is that there's some trees that it's just a little bit difference in the sugar content of the sap, but there's definitely favorite trees that are hit over and over again.
Yeah, any other questions for Connie at this point?
I have a question. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, cool. I've been having technical difficulties with my devices, but I'm doing it on the phone tonight. So here we go. So the picture, like the last slide you showed with the woodpecker that is attacking that tree, what we have learned in the past, yeah, is that sometimes those, like if a woodpecker goes after a tree, then beetle can go after it, and then eventually maybe another animal like a small rodent or a bird or something can like kind of live in that cavity. Is that possible with this situation, or is it not useful at all on a biodiversity standpoint?
Well, I think it adds to the biodiversity. I mean, the sapsuckers are coming from both the sap, and also insects get drawn to and sometimes stuck in the sap. And so the birds come back and they're getting some of the insects also. So it's definitely a resource for the sapsuckers. Whether or not, in this case, like the picture on the right, it's a fairly small diameter stem, so it's not going to be large enough to, create a large cavity. That one of those first pictures I showed that had those huge branches, when those huge branches break off, those are wonderful sources of, cavities for lots of animals and birds. So it just depends on, what size the tree is and what the damaging agents are. But I've been involved in doing some pruning and young stands of alder, and usually there'll be a couple trees, a small percentage, maybe 3 or 4% of trees will end up getting sapsucker damage. And if there's a lot of damage, it can be a weak point in the tree. So sometimes the top will break off, and that, will introduce decay into the stem. So I don't, sometimes people get upset about sapsucker damage and they say, well, how can I prevent it, or what should I do about it? I always just figure it's not going to be that common, and I just use it as, it's nice to see their sapsuckers using the area kind of thing. So you just have to kind of go with the flow on some of those things. You're not going to keep sapsuckers away from the trees, and I don't think you would want to keep them away from the trees.
Hey,
Yeah, that's
Connie.
exactly what I've seen also, Connie. I've got a lot of alder on my various properties, and it is interesting that the sapsuckers will go, like you said, to a very limited suite of trees and not others. And it's not that they're focusing in one area. It literally seems like a tree by tree decision, because I can have a couple of trees that are infected, or not infected, but affected by the sapsucker, but all around them, multitudes more trees that are not. So it's really your point that maybe they're going after a particular sugar content in a particular tree that just has the genetics to produce, higher sugar content, I think is really interesting.
Yeah, and it is interesting that sometimes when you look in those areas, you can see a couple individual holes on other trees, but then they just left those trees and went away, and then they found their favorite special trees that they would keep coming back to. So
Hey, Connie. I imagine keeping the alders that they're already using and attracted to could possibly be a deterrent from them going after other more valuable trees as well.
yeah, it's hard to say because if they've not chosen the other trees in that area because they're not as sweet, they may just go to a different stand. But I would definitely tend to keep the ones that they're already going after, because I don't see any value in cutting them down. I'd rather keep the sapsuckers around. But I don't think this is an area that's been studied a lot, but I've just heard several people like Kirk say, yeah, it's just a few trees here and there. It's not like a whole general area of damage that we need to be concerned about. Okay.
I had another question or point.
Sure.
Sorry. So you mentioned before about maybe it's the sugar that's drawing these sapsuckers to the individual, the specific trees. And Kirk just said that it's kind of blotchy how they go jump around, in an area. Now, earlier in this class, we learned about trees being able to talk to each other essentially using mycorrhizal fungi through networks in the roots and being able to help basically send carbon to a tree that needs it or something like that. And before I took this class, I have learned a little bit about some research that was done with soft stem or like herbaceous like plants like tomatoes and stuff like that, where they'd be able to kind of talk to each other about if one tomato is being attacked by a disease or an insect, then the other plants would be able to put off some kind of a defense against that. And you also just mentioned that not much research or study has been done on this. I was just wondering if it's possible, or if you've heard anything or know anything about the potential of trees developing defense against these sapsuckers, and maybe that the one that's infected is would potentially be able to communicate with the ones that are nearby, then to somehow change the way their sap tastes or something that would then deter the sapsuckers? Or is that just too far-fetched?
Well, really, the more that we learn about how a lot of plants and animals function, it's hard to say that anything is too far-fetched. I was actually reading this book about birds, and they were talking about the godwits and how they navigate thousands of miles, and one part of the story has to do with quantum entanglement, and it's just fascinating to think that there's all kinds of very, very sophisticated biology going on that we know nothing about. In terms of the sapsuckers, I think it could be quite interesting to study them in more detail to see, what they're using, where they're using them. Generally, the sapsucker damage, I think, is more of a concern to people than a concern to the tree itself, because the damage looks unattractive to a person, perhaps, but it's not killing the tree. So it's not damaging it in the way that, I think some of the past plant interactions where you're actually cutting branches off or, breaking the top off or something. The top part of the tree with the leaves is still doing its thing, and the central part of the stem, the xylem, is still moving the water up. So as long as the damage is not so complete that the stem gets broken off, I think it's just a different looking stem, but it's not necessarily a tree crying out for help, let's say. But it could be quite interesting to map in more detail to see what the difference is in percentage of trees that are damaged and where they are damaged in different areas. I'm just not aware of anyone that's really looked at it in much detail.
All right, thank you for that answer.
Sure. Okay, I'm going to move on to oak, and at the end, if there are any questions, we can always circle back. So early in my career, I did quite a bit of work with alder, and then in kind of more recent decades, I switched into doing a lot of work with Oregon white oak. Quite a different species, shade intolerant, tends to be long-lived, but as with alder, its height growth slows rapidly. Growth rates tend to be slow to moderate, so it doesn't have that super fast early growth that alder does. Can regenerate from seeds or sprouts. Even trees that are quite old will stump sprout. Can grow in a lot of different soils, soil types, low to mid elevation. You know, sometimes people say, oh, that's not a oak soil or something. It's like, well, it's a question of really how well a range of species will grow in that soil, and you may need to work harder to manage oak on a higher quality site than it would on a site where it's maybe too droughty for other species. To be a really important source of biodiversity in the landscape and important for wildlife, both the acorn production, but also the cavities in the stem, the lichens on the tree, the understory community that's associated with the oaks. Most of it's on private land currently. It's a very threatened forest type. The thought is that there's less than 5% of what was originally the oak type in the Northwest. But luckily for people who are interested and have it, there are some, at least have been some federal cost share programs for both planting and thinning. So as I mentioned, oak is important for both its acorn production, but we also want to look at its basic growth rates, and in particular, its crown form. So one question, I basically alluded to this a little bit earlier, but why do we have oak in Washington? And I came from the Northeast, and we had lots of oak species, and I came out here, and I didn't even really realize there was oak around here for a while. And partially that's because most of the oak that's in Washington is not considered to be a climax species. That is, that's not the species that will continue to be on that site for a long time. So in most cases, it's going to succeed to Douglas fir, western hemlock, except on the driest or most fire-prone sites. The oaks and prairies at Fort Lewis, Joint Base Lewis-McChord, and really throughout the kind of Puget Sound and Willamette Valley down into California, but they're really a legacy of many, many years of Native American burning. Kept areas open for hunting. It's easier to gather and increase yield of food crops, and they definitely wanted to harvest the acorns. So if you're interested in doing something with oak now, a lot of areas don't have oak, so you would need to think about, well, I'm going to try and plant or seed some oak, so oak regeneration. But there's lots of animals that consider acorns to be just, you know, very high calorie, very favored species to eat. And also the seedlings will often get browsed. And in addition, we often need to think about how to best plant it, because often the planting is done on harsh sites, that is the drier sites. So, so we've developed some different techniques. We have a publication on regenerating native oak in the Pacific Northwest. And these just some examples. This is where it's been scalped around something that's been planted. In this case, these are some they call seedling protectors. In this case, we have a plastic weed cloth. It has holes in it so the water gets through, but it keeps the weeds from growing up around the oak seedlings. There's lots of different types of protectors. So just as an example, these are some seedlings we planted at 13th Division Prairie on Joint Base Lewis-McChord. And if we didn't do anything, so you see this little green thing here, after 3 years, the seedlings we planted were shorter than they were when we planted them. So either animals ate them or the top died back. So then we have, this was in this particular study, you can see the yellow part of the bar was what we call the shelter effect. So planting it inside a shelter, and the red was the weed block effect. So we got a benefit from both of those. And just some other examples of different types of shelters. Early on, you're going to get the best growth in these solid shelters, but you're also going to get quite a bit of benefit from controlling the weeds. But in general, the survival of planting oak is pretty good. You need to start with good quality seedlings and take care of them. But certainly weed control and protecting them from seedlings from being eaten are quite beneficial in the early years. So the next topic to talk about is what I call oak release. And this is just an example in that you can see these oak trees are basically at, they're not going to get much taller in height. They're basically at their maximum height. Whereas the Douglas fir, it just keeps getting taller and taller. And Douglas fir is a wonderful species, and it has great long-term height growth potential. It makes a ferocious competitor for oak. So we selected oaks in several, mostly fir stands and joint-based spruce and cord. And so these were trees that were kind of in the mid-story, and they actually were older than the Douglas fir. So they were there first, but the Douglas fir came in and grew very well and is overtopping them. And this is a common problem in many areas where there's still some remaining oak. So we went in and we put in these different treatments. So if we assigned a control treatment, then these were all the Douglas fir that were around the oak trees we were studying. And then we put in these treatments where we cut the Douglas fir out just right around the oak trees, or where we gave them a lot more space. So in this case, we cut on average 15 Douglas fir trees to benefit our oaks. In this case, we cut 6. So they're very, very different treatments. And we looked at the growth for the first few years, and most of these oak trees in the study were very suppressed, but I was impressed that even though their growth rates were low, even these very suppressed trees could respond to the treatments with increased growth. So you can see the bottom part of the bars, the red part, was just years 1 to 3 after the conifers had been removed, and you can see that they were definitely growing more than the control trees, and this half release was in the middle, and then there was even additional growth the next few years. And then 10 years there was additional growth, and really, as you might guess, it's not just what treatment it was put into, whether it was called this full release or thin only, but it's actually the specifics of how many, how much competition there is around each tree. And if there's not much competition, the growth rate might be fairly good, but then it can go down very fast. So as I mentioned, this is not a shade tolerant species. It may survive for, several decades, but its growth rates are going to be much less. So we did some modeling, and I think this is kind of an interesting way of looking at it. We had a lot of, we got data from all over the Northwest, and then we developed some models. So if we start with what we call a one-story stand, so basically saying that the oaks and the conifers were at about the same general height, and then we looked for what happens over 50 years. And we saw 40% of the oaks died, and these, what we would have called kind of a conifer oak stand, transitioned to having kind of one layer, one kind of this canopy layer, to basically having this upper layer of conifers, and at this point, some lower levels of oak. So suppose we start with that type of condition, and there were a lot of stands out at Joint Base Lewis McChord like this, but also many in the Willamette Valley, up in southern Vancouver Island, where the Douglas fir is already well above the oak. So we have this upper story of conifer, and then you have this lower story of the oaks. And we did a 50-year projection, and we found that 80% of the oaks will die during that 50-year period. And this was with thinning. So even though we were spacing out the Douglas fir a bit, there still wasn't enough light getting through that the oaks could grow well and survive. And part of it, as I mentioned before, is they just don't have the height growth potential. So they just fall further and further behind. So I know a lot of times people say, well, let's just thin. And in some cases, if you do something like the full release, you can definitely benefit the trees. But if you just do a light thinning, your oaks are not long. They're not going to survive long. And so then this other example from the modeling is if we do something like the oak release, then the oaks grow much, much better and have much lower mortality rates. So probably, within the Northwest, releasing oaks from overtopping competition is the most common concern. But in some cases, they're fairly dense oak stands. And so we actually have done a little bit looking at this thinning within an oak stand, what I'm calling this oak to oak thinning, where you don't have conifers that you're releasing, you're just spreading your oaks out, thinning your oaks to give the remaining ones more space. So in this case, you can see that we removed all of these smaller trees, these light gray bars, and just had the trees left that were in the larger diameter class. So people often say, well, should I remove clumps of trees or should I just thin within the clump? And as I mentioned, oaks can sprout, stump sprout. So if you had an original stem and it was cut or burned, you can get many groups of trees that all are coming from the same root system. So you can both you can consider removing a clump or you can thin within the clump. So what would you want to do? And in dense stands, I think you would want to do both. You would want to remove whole clumps, but also thin within the clumps. So, there can be very dense stands. So this one example that we did, we actually removed 80% of the stems because we're taking out lots of these little stems that are not growing very well. And then we look at them over time and we can see where we've thinned them, that all of the trees basically are growing at about the same growth rate, which means that they're not competing much with each other. So they have a lot of good space for each tree. So one thing that we've done over the years is do acorn surveys. And we've both had a lot of citizen science part of this, where people just signed up and collected information, and every year they would go out and survey trees for their acorn production. It wasn't counting, it was just putting them into categories, whether just no acorns or just a few or a fair number or a lot, just big categories, but then the trees were measured and different types of information were collected. And then we also did a lot of detailed research studies on this also, but it was so great having all the citizen science data because we could really look over a really wide geographic area. And we looked at, the effect of different tree site stand factors and patterns over time and space. And it's really an interesting project. And we did several publications. So if you're interested, you can follow up on that. So one of the things that we wondered before we started the project is how important is it that you have the trees kind of spaced out for acorn production? So I like to call it the hand versus the fingernails. So in the fingernails, think of just the part, just the part of the fingernails is where you have live branches and leaves. That's the part of the crown that's really going to be able to produce acorns. Whereas if you have what I call a hand type tree, one that's spaced out with a large crown, they're going to grow many, many, many more acorns than these fingernail trees. Even if the space, the horizontal space is the same for a hand tree than a fingernail tree, just because of the amount of crown area. So it seems logical when someone explains it now, but at the time we were kind of scratching our head. Does it really matter if we thin these out, or are they, is it just putting more acorn production on fewer stems? But the answer is yes, it does make a difference, because we're really getting light down further into the crown, and so a much greater percentage of the crown then can contribute to acorn production. So the most productive trees for acorn production are going to be ones that have large crowns, whether they've been grown that way or whether they develop that way after thinning. And one thing that we noticed when we were doing the project is that many of the trees developed epicormic branches after thinning. And these epicormic branches are new branches that form on the bole after some kind of disturbance. It could be a thinning, it could be an ice storm, it could be a fire, but you can end up with all these little sprouts. And we were really curious and quite interested to see that about 3 years after thinning, we started to observe getting some acorns produced on these little new branches. So even though the trees may not look beautiful just a few years after thinning, they're starting to develop in ways that we'd like to see them really pretty quickly. So I mentioned that there was a lot of Native American burning that was responsible for keeping these areas open, controlling the understory and the invasion of other trees, particularly conifers, but even keeping the oak stands from getting too dense. And many areas now, for example, out at Joint Base Lewis and Court or out at the Lima Mound.
Yeah, I was gonna say maybe you should.
But other areas, they do have active burning programs. So that's my formal slides. So I hope you enjoyed learning a little bit about some of these neglected species, and I'm ready to go back to questions.
Well, I'll start it off. The students in my class, excuse me, are working on forest management plans for a portion of the forested evergreen. And the area that they're working on, aside from a couple root rot pockets, has a pretty contiguous canopy. It's 2 different stands. One is a Douglas fir stand at a fairly high density, and the other is a kind of a mixed hardwood stand. Again, a contiguous canopy. So even though it's a porous canopy seasonally, it's still relatively dense. Given the age of the trees, it's a horizontally thick canopy. Recognizing the wildlife value of oak, as far as its acorn production, to what extent is it shade tolerant in different conditions, and or to what degree would you need to open the canopy if we wanted to introduce some oak or try to culture oak in some portion of the forest at evergreen.
So most tree species are a little bit more shade tolerant when they're young, and they seem to become less shade tolerant as they age if they're not a shade tolerant species. Oak is not very tolerant, and so if you want to manage oak, you definitely need to have some areas that are really being managed primarily for oak. It could be pockets that are being managed. As in some cases, I've heard people say, well, I'm going to manage, close to buildings or close to ball fields, or, close to other areas that you don't want to have a tall conifer stand. You could say, well, we're going to designate this area for planting or this area for, for oak that is really best suited for managing something that's not going to be, tall and, coniferous stand. Certainly, it's kind of fun to germinate, your acorns. Oak is an interesting species in that they actually germinate in the fall, whereas most tree species in the Northwest, the seeds germinate in the spring. They can, it's interesting to watch them, how quickly the roots, they send a root down very quickly into a pot. So it's an interesting species to grow in a nursery or greenhouse kind of setting. It can be a difficult one to just sow in terms of, just put acorns out in an area because so many animals will come after them. I've heard people say, well, if I plant them very deeply, like 6 inches down, or if I put little, metal chicken wire cages over them to try and protect them. But most people will actually grow a seedling and then plant the seedling. In terms of conifer stands, one thing you can do is create some gaps, but those gaps are probably best suited for managing other tolerant tree species. So for example, big leaf maple is one that could be favored in a gap, as well as hemlock and cedar. So we have a project called the Olympic Habitat Development Study, where we have created stands managed with skips and gaps. And so we've created areas where we found these like kind of microsites of species that we could favor. And then we have planned to cut the conifers, particularly create gaps to favor those species that are there. And we actually just a few months ago produced a GTR on managing the skips and gaps that kind of goes through some of the, how to do it kinds of things. And so if you can't, I'm sure you could find it online, but if not, just let me know, and it's something you could add to your resource list. Did I answer all those? I don't know. You had a lot of parts to your question. I'm not sure.
Yeah, no, that was it. Mostly, introducing oak into existing hardwood or conifer stands. What kind of canopy opening or canopy gap would you need to be successful?
Yeah, you'd want big ones. I mean, what I've told people, we have a GTR call for oak release, and to me, there's not a right or wrong answer. Sometimes people, they want to continue to manage the area primarily for the value of the conifers, but they definitely want to keep some oaks in that stand. So rather than doing a general thinning to favor the oaks, I encourage them to, pick the 10 oaks that are in the best shape, and then, give them more space. So you're creating these kind of oak-centered gaps in your conifer area, rather than trying to keep a lot of sad-looking oaks hanging on for another couple decades, but the crowns keep getting smaller and smaller. It was actually interesting when we started working on this project, we were talking about how dense the stand has to be before it will kill the oak. But it's actually quite tricky because you can come up to a tree and it's 95% dead, but it still has a couple live sprouts. So is that alive? Is that dead? You know, whereas a lot of other species, you know, once they start going downhill, the entire stem dies very quickly.
Hey, Connie, how are you? I have a
Hi,
question. I was interested in your tree modeling information that you had and how you modeled tree growth. I just would like to know a little bit more on how you did it. Is criteria you used, precipitation, sunlight, whatever these, and is it a commercial program that you used for the modeling, or is it just mathematical modeling?
So we basically collected the data to refit some existing growth models. And so, and then once we had the information from those growth models, then we used a visualization program to show kind of the responses. And so we've actually looked at it in a range of things, and we do have some publications out where we, you know, describe the different kinds of conditions. And like we have graphs where we show what the mortality rate is going to be based on the height of the competing, you know, the competing trees, and you know, definitely it's the rate at which things happen is going to be much faster on higher quality sites than on, you know, lower quality sites. So, you know, we looked at a lot of different combinations of things. And
Great, I really appreciate that. Thank you.
sure, you're welcome. Yeah, actually, one thing I found with some of these neglected species is that the representation of those species in some of the existing growth models has been extremely small. So we had one growth model, I think, and it had like 13 oak trees in the entire database that was used to make the model. And another one had like 40 or 38 growth trees, you know, trees. And we managed to collect data where we had several thousand trees. So, you know, I think our growth modeling is a lot better than could have been done before we started pulling all the data together. But it's not like, you know, we don't have millions of data points, but we still have quite a bit more than used to be available.
Thank you.
Hey, Connie. I was gonna ask, you were talking about the use of weed blockers for oak seedling establishment.
Uh-huh.
I work on some oak plantings, and definitely the biggest challenge we've had is getting them established to the height where they're not going to be out competed by other shrubs and grasses. So I just was wondering what, like, if you could talk about the weed blockers in a little bit more detail, or like what kind of materials you were using, that kind of thing.
Yeah, so the material that we actually use, I looked recently and I couldn't find it online anymore. But it was a perforated plastic that was specifically produced for this purpose. It came on a roll, and we got these sheets that they were 4 feet by 4 feet. And then they had a split so you could, you know, get it over the seedling. But, you know, I think you would just have to see what was available in the horticulture business, or, you know, certainly you can try doing some, you know, controlling of the weeds in other ways, you know, whether you're using chemicals or whether you're using manual labor or, you know, other kinds of things, and then try and keep the weeds down by putting wood chips or, you know, other kinds of things on to try and smother the weeds. But you'd have to really, you know, like some kind of landscape cloth we've used. But the thing with landscape cloth is it only works if you cover it up with something that's going to block the light. So, you know, whether it's bark chips or in case the landscapers, they may, you know, use some rocks or something, but, you know, you really need to cover things up. And then another thing we found is that you have to be really careful that you're not producing a situation where you're super favoring the weeds that are right around the stem. So, you know, if you don't get them back from the stem, often they come up around the hole that you've created. So you need to work really hard to make sure you're managing that. And then, but yeah, no, I mean, I'm really glad that you've been involved in a project where you're trying to keep the oaks, you know, benefit the oaks, and, you know, good luck to you.
Thanks, I appreciate it. Yeah, we've used a lot of, we tried mulching, and then just like a lot of manual labor trying to weed around the and around the plantings and stuff. And we've had some success, but you know, some of the sites we're trying to plant in, they're still, you know, kind of shrubby and stuff. So you know, certain sites have been better than others.
Yeah, and in some cases you have to be careful too, because you can get voles that get underneath the landscape fabric, and they can chew on the roots. We haven't had that as a general problem, but occasionally we've had that as a problem. So it's kind of frustrating that you can do things, and it seems like you can be very successful on several sites, and then another site you just have one problem after another. We had one problem, we had a lot of pocket gophers, and those pocket gophers seem to really like our oaks. But other cases we've, you know, generally had pretty good survival, but it's just been a little bit of a challenge getting the oaks up. But we've really liked using the seedling protectors and some way of controlling the vegetation the first couple of years.
Awesome, thank you.
Thomas, you looks like you have a question or comment.
Yes, I do. Okay, thank you. I'll take off the little marker. Okay, so I was actually talking to Kirk about oak a couple days ago, and the reason why is because I researched in a 50-year plan, oak and red cedar would be potentially better like suited for warming, for climate change. And so I was going to ask you if those two trees, like in the models you were showing us, you know, like obviously a Doug fir stand is probably not going to be a good place to put a bunch of oaks or whatever, because it's, you know, the Doug fir grow really fast, and therefore, like you said, are really competitive for light and everything. But I believe like red cedars grow at least a little bit slower. You know, I think they go pretty slow. I don't know what the speed is like relative to how fast an oak would grow, but I guess, yeah, those two species were ones that stuck out as far as like being tolerant of warming climates, as well as oak specifically sequesters carbon really well, apparently, from what I was researching. So yeah, so in planting a red cedar and oak, like in a hardwood stand, like would there be a better chance of success? You know what I'm saying? That makes sense?
So the species that a lot of people have talked about kind of partnering up are alder and cedar. The cedar can grow up through the alder over time because it's shade tolerant. And but with oak, because it's not shade tolerant, I would tend to put it in groups where it's by itself or it's with something else that's growing slowly. It could be ash. In some cases, it could be a pine. But the main thing is that the conifers not be very dense and often kept in clumps. So if you had a general oak area, but then you had your, whether it was cedar or pine or something else, you had them in some clumps, not evenly distributed throughout the area, because the development of the crown and the development of the height of the oaks is going to be greatly impaired if they're shaded much. So they definitely don't like sharing too much. But some other species can you really need to match that tolerance, shade tolerance. So like I said, big leaf maple, shade tolerant. It could go with cedar. And one of the interesting things about cedar and alder is that the cedar is kind of a calcium accumulator, and then the alder is a nitrogen fixer. So, both of them are adding some contribution to the soil. Oak, I think, definitely is one that should do well going forward with climate change. Hopefully it's one that we're going to learn more about in our management over time. Cedar is one that I think has got some potential also, because it can start growing earlier in the spring if conditions are warm, earlier than many of the other species. The tricky thing about cedar is if it's growing on an area that's kind of a wet soil, and then it gets a lot drier, so its root system may be fairly shallow, and then when it gets dry, then the tops die back. So at least that's my theory about why you see the spike tops on the cedar and places on the Olympic Peninsula, is that you have areas that every so often get quite dry, and then cedar can't tolerate that. But on the other hand, if it's one of those moist but well-drained sites, and cedar can get its root system established well, then it can tolerate droughty conditions quite well. Some people think of cedar as just being a wet site species, but as you are suggesting, it can grow on a wide range of sites.
Thank you.
Other questions for Connie? Well, I have one along those lines. We often think about just planting trees, either in groups or of the same species, or companion planting, as we're just talking about, 2 or 3 different tree species together. But I'm wondering, given how challenging it is to get oak established, especially on brushy sites, are you aware, or have you done any studies with planting understory associates with oak? And if so, what might those associates be? My theory being that if you're planting oak along with, say, some shrub associates, might there be some of that? Might we kickstart that mycelial, communication process between the oak and its understory plant associates that may help oak survive a little more in otherwise a foreign environment? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I'm not aware of anyone that's actually done that. I know in terms of general restoration projects, many people have focused on trying to recreate the structure first. And the most critical structure is getting the oak trees up. And with the idea that once they get up a little bit, then they are starting to create the environment that would make sense to reintroduce some of the understory species. But there's no question that there's a lot of unknowns about, how some of these things are going to work. Certainly the edges of stands, I think if you've got some oaks already there, it would make sense to extend, on out into an unplanted area rather than, just starting in the middle with the idea that there may be some benefits from, what's already there in terms of root systems of other species. So there's certainly lots of things that, hopefully you and the students can contribute to going forward, because these are neglected species. So there's lots that we still need to learn. And I would say, if there's some specific questions that have come up tonight about some publications and you can't find them, just, send me an email and I'll see if I can, send you links to the publications that people are interested in.
Yeah, thank you. We've got about 5 more minutes. Does anybody else have any questions for Connie? Yeah, Savannah.
Yeah, I just had a quick question. I don't know if you know about, like, I don't know if this has been tracked. I haven't read up on it or anything, but I was just thinking if oaks would have a better survivability if they're grown in like containers until like they reached a height where they could be more competitive to weeds and other understory species. I don't know if that's a thing.
Yeah, it absolutely is a thing. And we have a guide to regenerating oaks, and I think you're going to get the best success if you grow them in long containers that are going to air prune from the bottom, so that instead of having a root that goes down and then just circles around, you can get a root that has a lot of side roots. And I think we've got a picture sketch or two in this guide to regenerating oak that, shows what the different root systems look like, and, kind of a little bit about the success we've had with outplanting with different types of root system configuration. I sent someone actually down to a nursery in Oregon, I don't know, it must be 15 years ago, to pick up some seedlings. And they came back with these oak seedlings, and I was shocked because they almost looked like pencils. They were straight, and then there was just almost no roots on them at all. And I was like, you paid for these? But the oaks had sent their roots down so deep, and that nursery had not managed to make it so that there were a lot of side roots. And then they had just cut the bottom of the roots off, and those oaks did not grow very well. So that's definitely not the kind of oak that we want to be planting. We want to plant ones that have some decent lateral roots on them, so that they've really got a good chance to get started. The faster we can get them up, those first few feet, it's going to be that balance between you want to get a good above ground leaves feeding the roots, and then you want to get the roots down as quickly as possible to support the top. So you want to plant something that looks pretty balanced to begin with, and then hopefully, your different conditions that you have, early establishment, controlling the weeds in particular, will help get the seedling established quickly.
Okay, thank you, Connie. Well, I think we are at about time here, so I really appreciate you joining us and sharing that great experience with alder and oak, two of my favorite species. I'm managing dense stands of naturally regenerated alder on my land, and I've also planted dozens of oak on silt loam just to see how it does. And it loves the rich soils, I can tell you that. Yeah. It's doing amazing.
Yeah, it is amazing how often people have these ideas that these species, one species or another prefers some stressful condition when in fact they all seem to like the same, moist, deep, but well drained, silty loams or sandy silty loams. So good to hear.
Yep.
And I'm glad you got your mute thing figured out.
Yeah, I wish I knew what I did, but it worked anyway. All right. Well, thank you very much. Have a great night. We appreciate you joining us.
Okay.